the floor to Mr. Jean-Pierre Lacroix.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. Thank you for this opportunity to brief the Security Council today in line with Resolution 2495 of the 31st of October 2019. Mr. President, we are meeting in exceptional circumstances as the world continues to fight the global COVID-19 pandemic. The spread of the virus has not spread the Sudanese people and has already impacted the peace process as well as our activities in Darfur. In these dire circumstances, I want to begin by assuring you that the United Nations is fully mobilized to continue to provide support to the Sudanese people. Mr. President, since my last briefing on UNAMID in October, the Sudanese authorities and people have pushed ahead with the implementation of their democratic transition. Over the past month, the authorities have made progress on increasing women's participation in decision-making, as well as with regards to accountability and on critical reforms in accordance with the Constitutional Declaration signed in September last year. But these major changes in Sudan's trajectory remain fragile and continues to be resisted by some, as illustrated by the outrageous attack on the convoy of Prime Minister Abdallah Hamdok on the 9th of March. In this regard, I would like to express my sympathy and the United Nations' sympathy to Prime Minister and reiterate the Secretary General's condemnation of this attack and his solidarity and unwavering support of the United Nations to Sudan. Mr. President, there has been some progress in the peace talks taking place in Juba between the transitional authorities and Sudanese armed groups under the auspices of South Sudanese President Salva Kiir. Due to the measures related to COVID-19, the talks have been taking place indirectly and have moved online since the beginning of April. Final agreements have been signed on the central, northern and eastern tracks of the negotiations. On the Blue Nile and South Kordofan track, an agreement was signed between the government and the Sudan People's Liberation Movement North Malik Agar faction. However, no agreement has been reached with the faction of the Sudan People's Liberation Movement North, led by Abdelaziz Al-Ilu, due to the lack of an agreement on the issues of secularism and self-determination. On the Darfur track, a framework agreement was signed by the government and some of the armed groups, but a final deal has yet to be reached and the talks have been extended again until the 9th of May. Unfortunately, the Sudan Liberation Army Abdul Wahid faction has remained outside of the process, hampering efforts to address the concerns of his supporters in Darfur. Nevertheless, following the Secretary General's appeal for a global ceasefire, the Sudan Liberation Army Abdul Wahid faction agreed to a de facto ceasefire while raising concerns about the security and humanitarian conditions in Darfur, particularly in the Jebel Mara region. The Sudan People's Liberation Movement North Abdelaziz Al-Ilu faction also responded to the call and declared an extension of the unilateral cessation of hostilities to parts of the two areas under their control for an additional 3 months, except for self-defense purposes. I encourage all actors to uphold the cessation of hostilities and reiterate our call for all armed groups to come to the negotiation table and contribute to paving the way for peace in Sudan. UNAMID has provided support to the Secretariat of the talks in Juba and has endeavored to increase the participation of civil society from Darfur in the process. Representatives of internally displaced persons, civil society and women's groups have been able to participate in the talks in Juba and convey their concerns, requests and proposed solutions. Their participation made the talks more inclusive, which is a critical element to ensuring sustainable peace. Mr. President, the general situation in Darfur has remained largely unchanged since our last report. However, there have been worrying developments in West Darfur at the end of last year and into the beginning of 2020, when intercommunal clashes left around 65 people dead. These events also left over 46,000 people internally displaced, while an additional 11,000 people fled to Chad as refugees. These developments have illustrated continued security challenges in Darfur, as well as the weakness of rule of law institutions in the area. Report of the participation of Sudanese security elements in this violence are particularly worrying. At the same time, civil unrest has continued throughout Darfur. the current harvest season also witnessed a sharp increase in attacks against farmers by pastoralists. Meanwhile, human rights abuses, some in the hands of uniformed personnel, remain prevalent. These challenges underline the persistence of some of the conflict drivers in Darfur, which may go beyond the scope of the peace process and will require a heavy investment in peace building. Mr. President, in response to the spread of COVID-19, on the 16th of March, the Sudanese authorities announced the closure of all airports, seaports, and land crossings until further notice and declared a public health emergency. On the 12th of April, they also announced a ban on all passenger road transport between cities and states. These closures, coupled with the suspension of all peacekeeping rotations, have had a severe impact on the movement of UNAMID personnel and the ability of the mission to implement its mandate, including as a result of the reduction in interactions with the populations, community outreach, and capacity building activities. The mission has immediately developed a contingency plan and adopted preventive and mitigation measures by implementing social distancing and remote working arrangements, as well as establishing quarantine areas for uniformed personnel in all team sites. It has also worked with local authorities to increase their preparedness to respond to the spread of the virus to Darfur. Some resources from the state liaison functions are now being used to support the implementation of the National Response Plan to COVID-19 in Darfur hotspots. Mr. President, the report in front of you outlines a drawdown and liquidation plan that envisages a sequenced closure of 14 UNAMID bases, the repatriation of 1,650 uniformed personnel, and a significant reduction of civilian personnel until the end of the current mandate. This was already an ambitious time frame, but now it has become unrealistic in the current circumstances. The pause in the drawdown till the end of May, the impact of COVID-19 outbreak, the suspension of all peacekeeping rotations until the 30th of June, coupled with the onset of the rainy season in June, have rendered an effective exit of our personnel by the 31st of October 2020 impractical. First, the measures in effect in Sudan and elsewhere to combat the pandemic will affect the mission's capacity to conduct a smooth and safe process. Travel restrictions, mandatory quarantine, and limited shipping options have already started impacting the mission, making it increasingly difficult to conduct even basic logistical operations. While all operational units could cease operation gradually before the 31st of October to ensure the timely closure of the team sites, including in high-profile areas, it will be necessary to extend the drawdown period for several months beyond the end of the mission's current mandate. Further, the rainy season, lasting from June to October, renders large areas inaccessible, particularly for the types of heavy transportation equipment required to move the troops and their equipment. In view of the infrastructure limitations, the number of personnel, as well as the nature and volume of assets to repatriate or transfer, the drawdown period will need to be extended into the dry season to allow for unimpeded, safe and continuous movements amongst UNAMID camps, as well as between Darfur and Port Sudan. In all drawdown scenarios, it is important to note that the mission's capacity to fulfill its mandated task, including the physical protection of civilians, will gradually decrease as operations through different camps are discontinued and form units deployed to these locations are repatriated. For the subsequent liquidation phase, it is recommended to maintain a uniform presence in El Fasher to ensure the protection of the logistical hub until the completion of activities. The requirements for a responsible drawdown, combined with the need to preserve operational efficiency and cost effectiveness, will require close coordination between the drawdown of UNAMID and the establishment of a follow-on presence. The structure, mandate, and establishment timeline of this new presence, once decided by the Council, will significantly impact the sequencing and overall timeline of UNAMID's drawdown. It will define the number of locations to close or hand over, the number of units and equipment to repatriate, and the assets to dispose of or hand over to the follow-on presence. Mr. President, the drawdown process must be carefully managed, considering the enduring threats to civilians in several areas of Darfur and the level of anxiety amongst the most vulnerable populations over UNAMID's exit. Indeed, the mission's drawdown should not signal that there are no more concerns related to the protection of civilians in Darfur. Conflict drivers endure, and some of the largest camps for internally displaced persons remain extremely volatile. Sexual and gender-based violence risks remain acute, and so do grave violations against children. It is critical that the departure of UNAMID be accompanied by alternative local and national efforts on protection to build trust with the local populations and the internally displaced persons. In this regard, we encourage the Sudanese authorities to invest in these efforts immediately, and UNAMID is ready to assist. It is also critical to make progress on the Darfur track of the peace process and for the population of Darfur to see peace dividends. Our focus with the follow-on presence in Darfur will be to preserve and consolidate the gains made over the years. In this regard, the new mission would build on the peace-building work that UNAMID and the United Nations Counter Team have conducted in the framework of the state liaison functions and reinforce it. The advisory and support role they provide to local authorities and security services could also be reinforced by deploying additional police and military advisors in support of local security communities. Mr. President, Sudan has entered a new phase of its history. In this regard, it is critical that we configure ourselves in such a way that will enable us to respond to the needs of the Sudanese. Under Secretary General Di Carlo, Special Advisor of the Secretary General in Sudan, Mr. Nicholas Haysom, and myself are working on the development of concepts and plan for a possible future UN presence in Sudan, based on our discussion with the Sudanese authorities and the guiding principles in a special report submitted on the 12th of March on the establishment of a follow-on presence with a Sudan-wide mandate. Under Secretary General Di Carlo will brief Council members on the planning process for a possible follow-on presence in Sudan. Our objective is to achieve a smooth transition to future UN mission that can help the UN better support the Sudanese people. For that, making sure that every mandate of the possible follow-on presence has the full support of the Sudanese authority will be a critical element of the planning process. Their consent is a key aspect of the partnership we envisage with them for the future. Ensuring that all the objectives and mandates of this possible future mission are clearly defined and adequately resourced will also be another crucial aspect of the planning process. As only then we will be able to address the expectations of the Sudanese authorities and the people of Sudan. Prime Minister Hamdok has asked the United Nations to accompany Sudan in this transition, and we are ready to do our part, and we know that we can count on your support in this critical phase of Sudan history. Thank you.